All right, folks, we'll give people another minute or so to sign on here, and we'll go ahead and get started in a moment. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started now. Thank you everyone for joining and being in attendance today. My name is Trevor Coons. I am a member of the HIMSS Minnesota board, or at least I'm a sit with anyhow. And it's my pleasure today to introduce our team. So today we have a webinar on medical device security for hospitals and other care providers from CynergisTek. This webinar is the first in a series of webinars for the month of September focused on medical device security. Please check out the remaining webinars on the Minnesota HIMSS website. We will be recording this event and making it available to all of our Minnesota HIMSS members. If you would like to be a speaker or sponsor for a future webinar event, please reach out to us via our webpage or by email, mn.hisisschapter.org. We will do a question and answer session at the end. Please type your questions into the questions section of the GoToWebinar, and we'll be sure to make those read out and shared during the meeting. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today. We have Matt Dimino, sorry, I apologize if I'm butchering your name, and Carrie Weichel. And so Matt is an advocate to help our nation's healthcare and public health sector recognize and prepare for tomorrow's cyber threat landscape. Mr. Dimino is a medical device security consultant at CynergisTek and is a top-ranked cybersecurity, which is a top-ranked cybersecurity firm. Matt's prolific 13-year career involves roles such as clinical engineer, professor, and researcher and consultant for a not-for-profit health and safety organization. Mr. Dimino holds a bachelor's degree in clinical engineering and an MBA in healthcare and has earned numerous IT security industry certificates. Motivated by his work that makes a difference, Matt is proud to continue research that extends his expertise into all domains of education, medical device, cyber threat mitigation, and the implementation of prevention strategies. Carrie Weichel is the director of managed security services for CynergisTek. She is responsible for vendor security management, VSM, and managed security services, or MSS, and medical device security. A healthcare veteran with over 20 years of experience in IT leadership, 12 of which have been specifically in security. Prior to joining CynergisTek, Carrie served as a senior director of security for Ascension Information Services. During her time, she was part of the leadership team that implemented Ascension's Security Operations Center, the SOC, as well as the company's eForensics security training and awareness teams, as well as the medical device management and incident reporting programs. Carrie was also responsible for the Access and Identity Management Program, which provides identity and access services for over 200,000 users across the Ascension system. Thank you, Matt and Carrie. And with that, we will go ahead. Matt,
wonderful. Sorry. Thank you for joining us all today. Again, the presentation is medical device security overview for healthcare delivery organizations, and this is part one of a three-part series. So we'll try to build on each one to try to give you an overview of all of it here currently in this first part. But for the most part, today's agenda, if it slides over there for me. Okay, today's presenters again are myself, Matt Dimino, and Carrie Weissall. You've already had our introduction, but we are part of CynergisTek. We are a cybersecurity firm. We do specialize in several modalities around cybersecurity, privacy, and healthcare. But again, my focus and a lot of what Carrie has to deal with is with medical devices. So again, the presentation is focused around the medical device security. And so the agenda consists of why medical device security services. So why do we care? Why is it a concern for individuals? And I think it's pretty clear. There's a lot of things are happening. A lot of things are changing. We're reading the news. We're seeing things that are occurring. We're seeing a lot more documentation. I mean, social media. It's kind of becoming everywhere, right? Even with the FDA. We're finding more and more reasons why we should be concerned about medical device security and those kinds of aspects of things. And it's a big challenge for many. A lot of people don't know where to start. So again, a lot of the goal for us is to try and help you provide a kind of that roadmap of how you can get started, kind of the tools and the attributes that are necessary and needed. And so that's item one, our agenda. Number two is the challenges. So I'll talk heavily about a lot of the challenges, and maybe it's already known amongst you all currently. Maybe it's not. You know, maybe this is brand new. This is a new endeavor. Maybe you're just here to enjoy the chat. But it's a significant challenge. It's no easy task. You have multiple stakeholders, multiple parties involved, and you're kind of bridging the gap between all those different stakeholders and parties, and it can be a real challenge in understanding the differentiators. And so we'll try to help define some of that. And then item three here is the MDS service components. So we'll highlight some of the key components that make a successful medical device security program. So the program consists of numerous pieces, and you got to start somewhere. And I think Carrie will be able to hit on a lot of that as we roll through the presentation. And part two and part three, we'll kind of show you some of the ROI and then more granular component of the services and system that you need to have in place. Step four here is the MDS tools and the output overview. So you got to start somewhere, and there are numerous tools, there are numerous platforms out there that can really, really help you in developing your program. So it is, I wouldn't say it's your starting point necessarily, but these tools really help and provide you the resources that you need to start making decisions. So it really is the integrator to some of your platforms. Item five is not really up for discussion at this moment. So what we'll do, that will carry on to session two and session three, where we'll highlight that more granularly, but we do kind of cover some of that in when our MDS service components with item number three. And then we'll certainly leave some wrap up and Q&A questions at the end. So if you have anything that we can try to answer for you. So why medical device security? I mean, again, it's inevitable. We all kind of know why. It's becoming a significant risk. And one of the things is medical devices are increasingly connected to the internet and have limited control over access. And I don't think there's anyone on the line right now who can tell me that they have full control over everything. These devices are often implemented ad hoc. They're often thrown on the network and people don't know that they exist. Sometimes physicians bring them in, different care providers bring them in, biomed might bring them in, patients and visitors bring these things in, and you don't even know that they exist. You don't know where they are. You didn't even realize it. And so they're becoming more connected, right? They're discussing, they're conversing with more and more resources internally and externally. So it is a significant challenge, and some of the tools that we'll highlight and show and demonstrate will kind of help you with that and show you, give you visibility over those devices and what they're accessing. Now, most healthcare delivery organizations do not have accurate connected device inventory. So you can go to your biomed groups, or you can go to your third-party service provider or whomever it may be, and you can ask them, how many devices do we have? Now, they have a CMDB just like any of you might. So they have a computerized maintenance service that they utilize. It's a database that they provide and put all their assets and attributes in. this is a service or a database that they live and breathe out of. This is everything. They're performing daily routine activities out of this database. And, they might have 20,000 assets, but they may believe that 3,000 of them or 2,000 of them are connected to the network. They try to coordinate and try to obtain these attributes at the time of procurement. But it's not always the case. And we often find, again, that these devices just slide in, or Dr. Smith or Dr. whomever or the clinician just kind of slides something in, or maybe you brought on board new physicians and they had their own equipment and they brought them with them, or you acquired another practice and they had devices that were procured that you didn't know. So we almost always find that the inventory is never accurate. It's almost never correlates to what people think they have. The other big thing here is between 10 to 15 connected medical devices per hospital bed, which equates to about 300 to 400% more medical equipment than IT assets or devices. And that's astonishing because, as stated, these things come in and we don't always know. Sometimes they will automatically, via protocols like DHCP, just get an IP address and start communicating and just do their thing. Others are procured in a proper manner where you've performed your assessments and you've filled out the appropriate paperwork. The vendor did their due diligence, and the different groups and parties put in their tickets, and voila, you had a nice process of something coming in, getting the appropriate items in place, getting put into the CMDB, getting an IP address assigned to it, and now you have that inventory. You know that this is an asset, a medical device that's going to be communicating on the network. But again, in reality is you really don't know. There are numerous other devices that are floating around that are brought in. And I'm well aware that there's numerous tools. There's different IS and IT tools that are very, very good at what they do, but they don't profile medical devices. They look at MAC addresses, they look at IP addresses, they look at certain attributes, even maybe some data flows, but they don't have a good granular view of, oh, that's a medical device. Or maybe they do sometimes, but they can't really profile what that device may be. And we'll discuss that here in a little bit. Now, with these medical devices, they average about 6.2 vulnerabilities per medical device. And these are significant vulnerabilities, and they really do vary on the CVSS scoring process, right? Some can be as high as 10, some can be as low as, well, almost 0, right? 1, 2. But it's significant enough, because if we don't know that they exist, we don't know their platform, we don't know their operating system, we don't know where they are, and we don't know anything about them, we can't prevent these, we can't remediate these vulnerabilities, we can't really do anything with that. So a lot of us have no idea, again, how many we have and what they correlate to and how they'll be impacted or affected. So having those kinds of vulnerabilities with medical devices, again, is pretty significant, because we don't realize that our medical devices are often on the same network segments and the same VLANs and whatnot as other devices that could be segues to an attack. And when you have a device that's extremely vulnerable, it can be prone to that attack. And you can take out a whole segment of medical devices due to something like that. The other item here on the right side is 60% of all medical devices are unpatchable. So we might have 3,000 connected medical devices, or again, maybe 20,000 total medical devices, and they don't allow patching. It's not uncommon. I think we've all kind of heard this, and it's very difficult to find this information. So some manufacturers put very nicely, they'll distribute this information. You can go to their websites, you can validate, you can verify. Great, you don't offer patching. Okay, do you have a remediation plan? Do you have something else that you can help me with? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So you have to explore the alternative options. We'll discuss some of those alternative options throughout the series as well. But I am finding that lately, with a lot of push from the FDA and push from organizations like us and you, that more manufacturers are providing them with updatable operating systems, with the ability to patch, with the ability to do some of these things. But it still comes to a point where it's extremely difficult. So when you have 200 of the same kind of device and they all can be patched, but it takes a half hour to do so, and you have 200 of them and it shuts down your entire clinic, it can be difficult, right? You have to approach it the same way you would with an IT system. You have to have that process and workflow in place. You have to have governance around it. You have to have a rollback plan. You have to have these things in place. And honestly, sometimes it's not even worth it. So there's alternatives to that again, we'll discuss. Most connected medical devices are unmanaged, right? I think this is pretty well highlighted in everything I've discussed thus far. We don't know what exists. If we don't exist, we know right away it's unmanaged. We know no one's keeping track of that. Now, we know Biomed does a really good job of maintenance, right? But they don't, the risk culture, the idea of medical device security isn't really embedded in them. It's not in their daily routine activities. It's not necessarily something that's in their mindset, and it hasn't been portrayed to them, So it's really something that I'm going to go fix it. I'm going to turn my wrench. I'm going to do this, and that's all I have to do, or that's all I have time for, right? Because I think we're all at the same point where we know we may not have the resources or the FTEs. Risk of breach due to devices holding large amounts of PHI. It's astonishing. So to find that we have numerous devices, high dollar assets that might have 500 plus records. They might have records from years and years and years. And it's not necessarily they're just on the device. It could be, a lot of times there's external USB hard drives that are just kind of taped to the top, taped to the side. And again, these are those onesie twosies. And they may not even really chat on the network. They may not be connected to the network, but my gosh, they're there in front of a patient, they're there in front of a visitor, and they're there exposure to the open. So it's very easy for a visitor or patient to say, well, not say, but to remove that hard drive that might be stored and stuffed with PHI. So it's kind of one of those things that we have to evaluate and coming up with an alternative method of storing that information and sending it to a repository that's more secure. Now, I think we're all aware an attack has the potential to cause patient harm, right? So we know that dosage from infusion pumps and things like that can be modified through an attack. So that is one of the biggest concerns, is maybe a widespread attack that can have an impact nationally or worldwide. And then attacks affect device availability and organization reputation, right? You get hacked, people know about it. If you have a device hurt somebody, everyone's going to know about it. There's no coming back from that. If you're the first to go down, everybody's going to know about it. So that's one of the critical pieces here, and that's kind of one of your highlights that you can kind of help with ROI on investing in some of these tools and action items that we'll discuss. So one of my favorite slides here is medical device security challenges. And first here, I'll look at the bottom left, and I'll start with culture. And culture is a huge gap, right? There's a lot of people who have no idea how to embed this in. There's a lot of people who don't know where to start and how to build upon it. So for one, you have communication gaps between CE and IT. It's just a challenge. It's difficult for the groups to get together. It's difficult for one to understand the other. And then there's limited training and knowledge, right? IT and IS may not be really familiar with the clinical data flows of a medical device, and vice versa. Biomed may not have any idea what the tools are in place, what IT and IS can see or do for them. And again, risk really isn't embedded into the culture. So again, Biomed's not really thinking about, well, is this a risk? Is this secure? Is this scary? Again, their embeddedness is turning wrenches oftentimes and working in that fashion. Next up is the legacy system. So we have numerous medical devices that are running old, outdated operating systems. I think we're all aware of that, and you'll find numerous hidden gems throughout your organization. Maybe you have tools that can find that, maybe you don't. Again, we'll discuss some of the tools that can find that for you. Longer life expectancy. My goodness, there's numerous devices will stick around forever. They may be one-offs, one-of-a-kinds. Again, Dr. Smith says absolutely not. This is the only thing that'll do what I want to do. I must keep it. So what do you do? So we have a lot of devices that are that way. Our CT scanners, they're $1 million, right? So $1 million to $1.5 million. We're going to keep it for 10 years. We're not going to get rid of these things every 10 years. And at 10% acquisition, as an annual contract, it can be very expensive to try and keep that maintained, keep those operating systems updated. Again, next up is unable to patch. So I've mentioned rarely can we patch. When we do, it's very difficult, and they're not available. The ecosystem is very complex, right? I've mentioned there's numerous vendors, different types, there's different software, there's different platforms. So you might have 1,500 patient monitors in your organization, but of half of them or a quarter of them might be different revision levels, different operating systems, because the way you procured them. It could have been through third parties, it could have been through the OEM. I know we're going through COVID, we're going through these situations where I know numerous organizations that just went to every third party they could to buy what they could just to accommodate. Well, if you get the same or if you get the same manufacturer and model, you may have gotten 13 different revisions, which at some point in time can be damaging. But totally understandable at this point. You got to do what you got to do. Now, the devices, again, are managed across phase of ownership and support. So numerous shadow ITs. You might have a random PACS guy or gal. You might have a lab person who kind of exists but kind of doesn't exist. You don't know who that person is or really what they're doing. Or even biomed. Sometimes biomed has kind of a shadow IT where they're doing some crazy things that people aren't really aware of. Lack of controls. And so there's numerous IT security controls that maybe many of you are familiar with. They just don't apply to medical devices. You can't really enforce them. It's extremely difficult. Most medical devices you can't apply antivirus or anti-malware to. Some you can, but most you can't. And in my experience, the ones I have, I've had troubles with. Even going to the OEM or the vendor and getting manuals and finding step-by-step, okay, here's my exception list. It tends to be cumbersome. And then even the clinical user calling me like, hey, I've got an error, and well, the only thing I can attribute that error to is maybe me putting in that control. So the controls can be very difficult sometimes, and even to manage. Physical controls are difficult as well. We start locking things down, we start locking things out, we might impede clinical workflow. So we have to come up with a process and have some governance around that process. As mentioned, lack of tools, limited tools and whatnot. I know ITIS have numerous tools, but they don't show the visibility of the medical devices. And then medical devices are obviously proprietary. So we have numerous RTOS and different operating systems that are highly specialized, highly proprietary. Some are affected by vulnerabilities, some aren't. These devices are very sensitive. So if we do something crazy, poke and prod at it, it can collapse, right? It can either stop working or need a reboot or whatever it may be. And I know everyone's scared to death of that because yes, it could be connected to a patient and we don't want to impede clinical workflows. And then we have our technical and operational dependencies. So again, proprietary networks. Maybe we have numerous different wireless requirements. We have computer hardware that might even be proprietary. I know numerous vendors have bought up small computer companies just to make their devices proprietary. So you have to utilize their service agreements and their service methods. But again, lots of numerous proprietary networks that are specific to an OEM. And as mentioned, insufficient visibility. So we lack accurate connected medical device inventory. So I know I ran through that pretty quickly, but those are the basic challenges that we deal with on a regular basis that everyone I think is faced with. And sure, there's going to be some miscellaneous throughout, but the primary key issues and challenges with medical device security. So with that, we'll kind of highlight and discuss some of the medical device security components, and I'll transfer this over to Carrie and let Carrie discuss these components for you.
Hi, good afternoon. So when you're taking a look at a comprehensive medical device program, you really need to take a look at it in phases. There's no way anybody can implement all of this at one time. Well, I suppose there is a way someone could, but I highly doubt they'd be very successful at it. So the first stage is really an assessment. What are you looking for? Do you know what's out there? Trying to understand what are those base practices that are really going to help you be successful. Then you need to take a look at how would you remediate those devices? What is it that's going to need to be done? And will it be IT that needs to do it? Will it be clinical engineering that needs to do it? That's actually something we'll talk about in a minute, but it's a big misconception out there about who owns fixing these devices. Reducing the risk that introduced to your organization. I know that multiple healthcare entities also carry cyber insurance. And one of the things that you're required to do to your adjusters each year is give them a report on any risks, any breaches, and what your expected level of risk acceptance is for the next upcoming 12 months. So these devices are part of that, and you need to know that. And then making sure that you're actually considering them as part of your IT risk and that they're not being considered as just a patient safety risk, because they're much more than that now. Once you figure out what you have and what you need to address, you need to take a look at what the program is behind that. What did you have? What don't you have? Standards, policies, procedures. Go through your MEMPs. What is it that you need to put in place to make sure that anything you remediated in the first step stays remediated and that you continue to build on that and build a program. The biggest piece of that is probably making sure that incident response for medical devices is part of your formal incident response plan. We all have incident response plans for IT, but we really don't think about medical devices. And I know that in a real life example, when you get that phone call that something's not working, it typically goes to IT as a network outage. IT doesn't have insight into the medical devices. They might know that that IP address is on a switch and maybe they know it's connected to a medical device, or they know that it's one that they've had to exclude from a scan because they think it's a medical device. But there's always going to be that wasted time, 20, 30 minutes, while somebody from the service desk figures out that, hey, this isn't an IT device. Who do we call? Who do we give it to? Does somebody physically go look at that device? Typically, you have orders not to shut off a port on a medical device. That's because you don't understand what's behind it. If it was a CAT scan, you might be able to turn it off. An MRI, you might be able to turn it off. Those all have local storage, but IT doesn't have that knowledge, and that needs to be fixed so that you can create an incident response plan. And then really, what does it take to support your program? How do you take what you've learned, the program that you built, and keep doing that? And I kind of refer to program management as stopping the bleeding. So you've done this remediation, you've fixed your devices, but if you allow devices with vulnerabilities to continue to be placed on your network and you're not managing them from a standard configuration or standard protocol approach, you're just going to keep bleeding. And your next assessment isn't going to look any better than the first one because you haven't stopped the practices that you're doing that are bringing in all of these devices that are not compliant, or you're just not setting them up with a base standard configuration saying every infusion pump that comes in on our network, we're going to change the generic password, we're going to turn off these network protocols, every device has to be set up the same. When you don't do that, you're just going to be in that circle of continuously assessing and trying to remediate. Next slide, please. This slide takes the risk assessment a little bit further, and there usually should be, well, there is for us, but there should always be 3 steps of this. You always want to take a look at what does your program look like today, and it's okay if your program is non-existent. You're going to be in great company with your peers if it's non-existent. But I bet if you look hard, you've got some documentation that you can leverage to make your medical device security program. And that is that I would bet you have IT policies. I would bet you have an IT security policy specifically. A lot of what is in your security policy would be able to be transferred into a medical device security program. And really understanding what are all of those pieces and trying to come up with a real level of effort. That's going to be difficult if you haven't done the technical assessment, but really it should start in that program assessment piece. What are we doing? What do we need to do? How do we get there? The technical part of the assessment always involves a tool. Getting a passive network scanner put on the tool so that getting a network passive scanning tool put on your network. There you go. That's a tongue twister for today. So you can actually see what is going on in your network. All of the tools that we work with are passive network scanning, so they are set up on your span ports. They're looking at all the traffic and then doing deep packet inspection on them so that they can see the type of medical device, the operating system from that device, updates for that device, what vulnerabilities are at that device. The better tools actually also incorporate the MDS2s, so you can do a little bit of investigation on what the patient safety options are there, as well as if you don't have the MDS2 for a device, you do an assessment and see that it still has the generic password. Without the MDS2, you don't know if you can change that password or more importantly, can that device handle individual IDs and passwords, which would always be the preference in the eyes of security. So you really need to understand what you have and what you can do with it. Part of the attributes that you typically get from a tool as well are the VLANs that they're sitting on. And understanding how many devices you have in a VLAN is critically important. A lot of the times you'll go to a site and they'll say, we segment our medical devices. Okay, well, how many segments is that? Well, one. So you put all of your medical devices in one segment. So if one medical device goes down, all of the devices in your site go down, probably not what you wanted to do. It was a good thought at the beginning. It's not actually in reality. You also want to take a look at, when you're looking at the types of devices that are connected on your network, you don't want to have multiples of the same device on a segment if you can help it. So if you have 2 CT scanners in your radiology department, they probably sit side by side in rooms. You don't want them both on the same segment. If they go down, you're going to have to defer patients because now you don't have the ability to do a CAT scan. So there's a lot that goes into understanding the VLAN information and really understanding what should be on those VLANs. You could also do some micro-segmentation, which would also help alleviate if one of the devices was attacked. But really, I think high-level segmentation is probably fine as long as you're not overloading those VLANs with multiple devices. What you really want to think of is the same thing when you do business recovery services, business continuity, DR. You really want to understand what is the impact on our health system if all of these go down. So if you treated your medical devices like you would a BIA, you would automatically come to the conclusion that you don't want to have them all in one VLAN, just because it wouldn't make any sense. So that's part of the information you're going to get from the tool. It also should be part of your remediation recommendations. There's going to be a lot of talk about segmentation. There's going to be a lot of talk about firewall rules, ACLs, and really the remediation recommendations is where this sort of gets sticky, because you come into this thinking that IT should have some oversight here, but this is really a clinical engineering problem. Well, it's not. It's mostly an IT problem, because most of the remediation efforts are not going to be go touch this device and go fix this device. They're going to be put it on a different segment. They're going to be maybe explore whitelisting options for that device. They're going to be rewriting firewall rules for that device. Most of the time, a touch is the last thing you want to do to these devices. There are some times where that happens. So a good example is infusion pumps at all the sites. There's always hundreds, if not thousands of them at every site. Most of them have 4 to 5 vulnerabilities. Now, you could fix probably almost all of the network ones by doing segmenting, although they're typically wireless, so that's a little bit trickier. The one that you can't fix is changing the generic password that's on that device. That would have to be changed with a device touch. Now, everybody has those devices out in the world, and so far, actually, I'm not going to say it out loud, but it's not something that would be prioritized. So even though if you did a report, your infusion pumps might come out critical or high because there's so many and they have multiple vulnerabilities, when you're making your remediation plan, you're going to say, those really aren't the biggest concerns. Usually ultrasound and anesthesia are, but those aren't our biggest concerns. So in our remediation plan, we're going to assume that at the next PM, that device will have the password changed. And if you're running a passive network scanning tool during that operation, you're going to see that maybe today you had 1,200, tomorrow you have 1,100, 1,000, so on. So the device will help you track those bottom level changes that you need to make, and you really don't have to panic about those. But it really is it's a group effort, but we kind of go into this with the wrong approach, that it's a clinical engineering issue, and it's really not. it's ours. Some of the work that you'll do in part of those remediation recommendations are based on the risk management strategy. That is taking a look at what is the level of risk this device is bringing into your organization, what's the category of risk that it's in, what are the strategies you want to take by remediation category, and then really what is that total plan, and what is the level of effort for that total plan. And it needs to not only be how we're going to fix these devices, but how are we going to fix our program? How are we going to start our program in some of the cases? But it's the remediation plan, and it's not just what are we going to do to fix these devices. It's what are we going to do to attack our medical device security problem. And that is the difference between just a tool running on your network or actually running a program and being successful. Next slide, please. So what you're seeing here is one of the level of effort summaries from the tool. And there are about 4. They all actually have, well, there's about 20, but the top 4 all have this sort of mapping. So when you're looking at what are your findings, you're looking at what do I need to do and where am I in this process for the program. So you can say, we really categorize it into 3 things. New development, you don't have anything in place for it, and you really need to get something in place and get it going. Media sanitization usually shows up here. Governance usually shows up here. Those are all in the new development stage. Refine and improve means you kind of have something going, but you've got to tweak it a little bit, and you need to make changes to it to get it to where it needs to be. Now, in a typical establishment, you're going to be right around 50-50 for new development and monitor and update. But that refine and improve section is actually really important because it means you started down a path to be more secure, but you didn't quite hit the mark. And with very little effort, you can make tweaks and move that into monitor and update. And what you want to do on this wheel is move everything from the left that's new development and refine and improve over into monitor and update. Once you've got it into monitor and update, you've addressed the risk, you're watching the risk, you're monitoring your changes, you've got a governance plan in place, you're actually doing what you said you were going to do, and you need to just continue to monitor. So you could look at this slide sort of as a maturity model for your program. The more that you move from the left to the right, the more mature and the more secure your program's going to be. Next slide. This is a picture of just kind of a level of risk from the network, the types of devices that are bringing risk onto your network. So in this example, there are over 1,200 network connected devices, and the tool is breaking them down, telling you what they are. And you can see, it looks like the word got cut off on the slide. That top number is infusion pumps, and it's always infusion pumps. Those little nasty devices just are everywhere, and they're in closets because nurses are hiding them and they don't want anyone to steal theirs, but there's always a higher number of infusion pumps. The next category, and it's very typical, would be patient monitoring. Medical workstations are devices that are attached to medical devices that are doing some sort of workstation level work. And then you have, in this case, you have your pharmacy and then medical building or device. But you can see over to the right that it's taking a deeper slice into what each one of these categories are. Most of the time, when you're talking about risk, you're going to end up dealing with PACS, anesthesia, imaging. It's just pretty normal, mostly because those are high dollar devices that you're expecting to have a longer ROI. If you paid more for a device, you obviously want it to last longer, but that means that device is probably bringing in a bigger level of risk, although this slide is just showing you what it is, but it's going to present a higher level of risk because you're going to try to manage that operating system longer. You're going to try to go without patches longer if they end of life that operating system, just because there's so much money in them. Linear accelerators are a great example of that. If you're doing any kind of cancer treatment at your hospital, they can be anywhere from $5 to $10 million. They're not going to want to throw one away and get a new one just because we can't update the operating system and you've had it for 4 years and now it's end of life. So you're always going to have to put some thought into what you want to do with those devices. Next slide. So this is taking a better slice at what those devices are and how many vulnerabilities they had. So if you take a look out of the 1,230 devices, 76 of them were reported to have at least one critical vulnerability. And I would bet that most of them had multiple vulnerabilities, but they had at least one. So if you take a look, you're looking exactly what we were just talking about. Your mammography, your CT scanners, your gamma cameras, PET scanners, higher dollar devices. I think this is the first one that I've seen the blood glucose monitoring system come up on. It must be the server because the devices don't usually connect to the internet. They connect to the server. So at any rate, you can take a look at just by the number of vulnerabilities, and you would say, some people would say, well, this is my remediation strategy. This is what I have to go fix. Not necessarily. Some of these are going to be more important than others. Some of them are going to be even worse vulnerabilities than others. The PACS workstations in this example, they actually were the worst and they had the most vulnerabilities, but they were also XP. So they go to the top of the list, but they wouldn't automatically go to the top of the list just based on that. Next slide, please. This is a different slice of that slide, just showing you how much risk is being brought into the environment by each type of device. So you have your high risk and you have your moderate risk. And in this case, you're kind of wanting to go from right to left instead of left to right because you want to get rid of the high risk. And not necessarily does that mean get rid of the devices, but get rid of the risk. What can you do on the right side of the screen there to move those devices from high risk to either moderate or low? And in this scenario, this is one where you have to know what your organization's appetite for risk is. So if you're in the automotive industry, you probably have a higher tolerance for risk than you would if you were in banking or if you were in healthcare. Now, healthcare kind of brings on its own level of risk. I mean, I think the average age of an application in a healthcare environment is 11 years, I think is the last one I read. So we already have probably a medium to high tolerance for risk, although everyone would assume it's lower because we're a hospital and we have to deal with HIPAA. But it's really quite the opposite. Because we don't spend money in IT, it's not our primary function. Patient care is our primary function. So updates to IT and updates to security end up being a lower priority, even though they have the highest potential for bringing in risk to the organization. IT is not our core set of values. Patient care is the core set of values, and IT supports that. So there's already a higher tolerance. But in some of these, you have to look at, okay, I could spend $4 million replacing, ultrasounds, or I could put in a microsegmentation and I could whitelist these devices if they're Windows 98. And I have effectively mitigated the risk that those devices are bringing into our network. Now, at that point, these conversations should have clinical engineering in them as well, because if clinical engineering is saying, sure, you could keep them and fix the security, but, I've got Max out there working on this thing 4 times a week, it's really going to, at some point, become a patient safety risk as well. Now you need to start blending those scores. What's the security risk? What's the patient risk? What's the total cost of ownership as you're going through trying to decide how you want to mitigate this risk and how you should classify it. Next slide. So we don't need to read the header slide. You guys can all read. We can skip to the next slide. All right.
Okay. So,
as you're taking the,
sorry.
Go ahead, Matt.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Nope. You're good. I'm good.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. So Carrie mentioned stage one, we were talking about a tool. And so she already mentioned that these are passive scanning solutions or passive scanning tools. So they don't have any agents. They're sitting at the span port at your core. They're kind of watching and monitoring all traffic. And the beauty of these tools that are available to you are the fact that they're able to parse very specific protocols from medical devices. So they're able to get very granular. So a lot of our Alaris, a lot of our Philips, GE, all of our top OEMs have some sort of very specific proprietary protocol. And a lot of these parties, these tools have spent the R&D time to analyze those protocols, and then they can actually decipher what these products are. And it becomes extremely granular. So rather than just saying, oh, that's an MRI machine, well, it can tell me it's an MRI machine. It can tell me what operating system, what serial number, all of its attributes about it, what VLAN it's on. I mean, it gets extremely granular about all that information that Biome doesn't have. It can even give me applications that are even on it. So if it's a Windows XP device and it's got a particular version of Adobe, I mean, sometimes that information is available. So real quickly, with time here, is this diagram that you see is kind of a likelihood, impact, and a device type. So utilizing one of the passive scanning solution tools, it can actually help you profile your risk. So even if you don't have your own methods and calculations, the tools can help you do this. And they kind of look at it from clinical impact, business impact, utilization, those kinds of things. They have their own algorithms. And within their algorithms, they can kind of help you quantify and classify what you want to do. And so the diagram here on the left kind of shows you that, and kind of shows you the likelihood versus the impact, and then kind of the category of the device itself. So we know we can just kind of have a better view of that. The one on the right is regarding anomalies. So they can actually see flow genomes is what I'll call them, and I'll show you another diagram of one. But it can look at exactly who, what, when, where, and why a medical device is talking to something. And you can see it's browsing adware domains, browsing malicious domains. It can see that it's FTP with known username and password combinations, or clear text username and passwords, or other things that shouldn't occur on the network. It can see. And it gets very granular. It can tell me exactly what the IP address, country of origin, all these fun characteristics that you can get really deep and lost in. So this is one of the tool vendors, and it offers, again, this view of your assets. And you can see some colored dots there on the left, and that just kind of indicates the status of the device. Is it on? Is it active? Is it communicating? So the red indicates that it hasn't been communicating in the last couple hours. Now, from my understanding, at least the last conversation I had with some of the vendors, is there's kind of a 15-minute lag, right? It's through the network and then back to the tool and to the GUI, and that way you can see it and view it. But so it's not necessarily real time, but there's a small lag in when it was occurring or when it was communicating and what you're seeing now. But it breaks it all down by device type, by device family, by device model, by operating system. I mean, we can get very specific with host names, the facility, and then again, anomalies. Does it see an anomaly? And what is its risk and impact score? And again, these devices provide all these kinds of details for you. Let's see here. Next slide. Okay, so here's another one from another tool vendor, and this is showing you medical devices. So it's showing 3,700 or 3,800 medical devices. You can see that I've got this one has about 20,000 IoT and about 20,000 IT, so about 40,000 devices total. And it will show you the granular details about and the percentages of what those devices are. Slide the mouse everywhere, but what the devices are, right? And what kind of vulnerabilities or what kind of alerts are associated with them. So of the devices that it shows on the left, about 45% of them, or almost 2,000, have some sort of clinical vulnerability, something that impacts clinical workflow. It might be an ICSM kind of alert that's associated with that. And then it kind of goes down the list of platform vulnerability. Is it something along with firmware or something like that? We have a separate firmware, but it kind of looking at the hardware specs. Is it got an old revision of something that pertains to it. Recalls, again, firmware, did it have any kind of a malicious attempt to the internet? Malicious internet connections, is it talking to places it shouldn't be talking? And a lot of these tools provide what I think we're familiar with as AI. So it starts to evaluate who and what it's talking to. So if I have if I have an anesthesia machine, or if I have something along those lines that's constantly communicating, and it kind of creates a baseline of what it talks to, how often it talks to, and how much data it's sending to and from. And then when you have these anomalies, or you have these behaviors that kind of stray outside of that, it can flag that. And that's where some of the segmentation policies and recommendations come into play, where it notices that, oh, well, you shouldn't be talking to China. Let me flag that. That's not the OEM. You should be talking to only the OEM. And we know the OEM is in some other country. So we'll put that in our ACL for your segmentation strategy. Let's see. Again, device type by distribution, which Kerry did show in other graphs as well, but this is able to break it down as well from a non-risk perspective. But this one has 1,400 patient monitors, blood gas analyzers, textile dispensing systems. I mean, anything and everything you can think of. These tools can profile them. They do extremely well at them. Some do much better than others. They all have different attributes. And that's the main thing that you need to take away when you kind of go back, maybe looking at these tools, is they have to fit your needs. Whether it's an IS or IT tool that's going to be purchasing it, or Biomed's going to be purchasing it, and what your goals are. And so you'll find some subtle differences that might meet the needs of your organization better than the other tool. If you're really concerned about your medical devices, again, the tools you're looking at are some premier tools that do really well with categorizing them and providing them into families and giving you that real good granular breakdown of them. And these are high risk. So this is from the data that we've been looking at. And so you can see with this data, our blood glucose meters, we have 97 of them, and they present about 28% of our high risk devices. And the risks are associated with the factors that we've been talking about: vulnerabilities, recalls, malicious internet sites, those kinds of things. And another flow genome here is what I call it, is this particular device. There's an asset associated with this, and there's internal communications, and it's broken down to protocol, and it's broken down to host name or system with an IP address. And then it's broken down to external systems. And you can see externally, this particular device is talking to a network time server, and then it shows the 15 external domains. So I can click on these bars on the far right, and it'll highlight the IP addresses. It'll highlight the information. It'll tell me again the protocols and how often is it upstream, is it downstream? What's that flow? What's that direction look like? And again, how much data is actually leaving this device and going to these external domains? So if you see something, or the product sees something that happened once, and it knows that it shouldn't happen, it'll flag that, and that provides you an opportunity to go to your network team or whomever, or your tools, and provide some of those segmentation strategies or even micro segmentation. Because maybe it is supposed to communicate with certain things, but you don't want it to talk via certain protocols. Right? SMB is a protocol we're familiar with. A lot of our medical devices right out of the box have SMB enabled, and we know we may not need that for most clinical functionality. So even though we need it to still talk to a particular device, like maybe the PACS server, but maybe we don't need that SMB protocol. So from a micro segmentation standpoint, we can block that SMB protocol via network tools and whatnot. So let's see here. That is the end. So that leaves us with some time for any questions. So we have our moderator who has any questions for us.
Yeah, so by way of reminder, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat and I'll read them. But one question I wanted to ask about, or to understand a little better, when you talk to, hopefully you can hear me a little better now. When you talk about hardware versus software vulnerabilities, could you give an example of kind of what a hardware vulnerability might be?
So most of the times the software vulnerabilities are related to the operating system, where the hardware might be specific to a board or again, board level in the medical device. So there's numerous radiology devices that actually utilize commercial off-the-shelf applications or operating systems that are kind of embedded in some of the components. And that might be more or less kind of the hardware piece of that. I think there's multiple facets to it where Yes, they're platforms where there's recall. So oftentimes, like the ECRI or Rasmus, and the manufacturers provide recall information, and then these tools can see that recall, and then they consider that also a hardware vulnerability.
Gotcha. Okay. I got another question here. Could you elaborate on what are some of the risks to patients, or give more high level or give more concrete examples of when vulnerabilities have been exploited? And so it says, e.g., like ransomware, or other instances that have made it into the news beyond HIPAA breaches. Sorry, there's a lot in that, but
Oh yeah, absolutely. So there's numerous situations where, again, most of our high dollar, high risk assets are Windows operating systems. A lot of them are XP, Windows 7, and they're not patchable. So I can tell you firsthand, numerous CT scanners are Windows 7 or Windows XP, and they're not patched. So when you get a piece of malware, and a perfect example is someone plugging in their device, their personal device, into these scanners, into these systems. You might have a rad tech who sits next to it, who works all day, and there's a little bit of downtime for whatever reason. They decide to plug it in or using USB to these devices. So when they haven't been updated in years, they're susceptible to all the vulnerabilities that are out in the world, right? Everything that's been known, that's in the database, the NBD database, and they can shut down. Anything that could happen to your computer can happen to that system, and it renders it completely unusable. So from a ransomware standpoint, once it's on the operating system of one of these multi-million-dollar medical devices, it ceases to operate. And I tell you firsthand, it takes many hours or days to get them back up and running. So from a standpoint of like an MRI or CT that I've got experience with, when I have these things crash, it takes me 8 hours to get it back up and running, get new drives in it, reload the operating system, recalibrate it. So you've lost the availability of care, and you've lost your data that was on there. And you don't know if you were breached because you don't know if records were taken, because you're not really 100% sure what vulnerability, what attacked you. So now you have to, like Carrie mentioned, go into your incident response, even go into forensics, and that takes the device out of service for an extended period of time. So having some sort of, as Carrie mentioned, an incident response and an ability to either engage with third parties or professionals who can analyze what happened, that system's down for the count. And if you only got two, now you're in a critical situation.
Yeah, well, fair enough. All right, final question here. You all had mentioned that 60% of devices are unpatchable. Apart from segmentation, are there other mitigation strategies that could be pursued?
Sure. One that's really common for Windows 98 is, or actually XP, and I say 98 because we just found one at a client the other day, and I'm still in shock a little bit. For XP, one of the tools that works really great, medical devices, pretty much their proprietors don't let you put an agent on the device, but you are allowed to add software as long as it doesn't interfere with the performance of the software that's running the medical device. So a lot of the PACS workstations that were XP, whitelisting is a great option. You can use all kinds of tools to actually whitelist the device, monitor it for 2 weeks, look for the executables that only need to run for your application, and then basically whitelist only what should be added there. You also could do personal firewalls. Those get expensive, but in some cases where maybe the network doesn't have the capability, or you're on an older segment of the network where you can't get as granular with trying to actually segment that device, you could do a personal firewall as well. And we've seen both of those used in cases that have been very successful.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you both very much for your time today. Matt and Carrie, it was an excellent presentation. I see we're at the hour, so again, we'll thank you. We'll thank all of our members for attending today, and please look forward to future webinar events on our website. And again, this is part of a 3-part series, so we'll hope you will all join us for our next meeting later this month, and for the third one as well. They're all in September. So thank you all again, and we will wish you a good day.
Thank you.
All right, thanks all. Bye.
Thank you.